Most people know about First Amendment protections, but most don't understand what rights we have. In fact, the First Amendment Center, an advocacy organization, famously found that more Americans can name the 5 members of the Simpsons family than they can name the 5 rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. So this week we'll talk about the First Amendment and free speech, including its historical and philosophical foundation, what's protected and what are its limitations there are to freedom of speech. And after this and the readings and the videos this week, you should have a better understanding of the First Amendment, what it means to your own life, and what it means when it comes to media consumption. These slides will contain some multimedia content. If you need to stop and pause, please do. Know that you can control the speed of this presentation at any time.
Congress shall make no law
respecting an establishment of religion
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof,
or abridging the freedom of speech,
or of the press,
or the right of the people peaceably to assemble,
and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
As you have just heard, there are 5 rights embedded in the First Amendment. Let's break down the individual rights. The first right deals with the right to practice individual religions and freedom from government and freedom from the government opposing an official religion on us. The second right deals with the freedom of speech, which means that individuals are generally able to speak out about issues no matter how controversial. There are some limits, but not too many. We'll cover those limits later. The third deals with freedom of the press. This freedom is meant to ensure journalists can publish information that citizens need, even if that information or opinions are controversial, offensive, negative against the government. Allowing free, open, and relatively unconstrained speech and press rights are vital, according to the founders, to ensure a vital marketplace of ideas. The fourth and fifth rights deal with the right of people to assemble and protest, and to petition and ask the government to change policies and practices that they disagree with. These rights are part of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Even though the First Amendment says the Congress shall make no law, courts have found over the years and interpreted the First Amendment to apply to all government entities from the federal government on down. To understand the purpose and use of these freedoms, it's useful to understand the system under which they emerged. Essentially, what were the early Americans thinking way back in 1789? You'll watch a short video on Canvas that will more fully explore the early history of the First Amendment and the historical and philosophical backgrounds that informs the creation of the First Amendment. You must understand the system the colonists before the Revolution were dealing with. They wanted to avoid the British system, which included lots of censorships in the form of licensing and seditious libel. That means to say, or to print something, you had to get that publication licensed through the government, and you could never say anything bad about the government, or they take your license away. They also wanted to avoid religious persecution, a reason some had come to the New World in the first place. Finally, decisions were based on the philosophical thinking at the time, such as that of Milton, who advanced the free marketplace of ideas theory. It says that the truth always wins in a battle with falsity. I'm not sure if that actually applies nowadays with the internet and the open democracy of that, which we discussed in the past. So keep that in mind when you think about what Milton says here. Other philosophers during that era expressed similar viewpoints, such as Locke and Blackstone. To make sure you watch the museum video on Canvas for a more complete and a more entertaining explanation of the early history of the First Amendment, like it wasn't the First Amendment first proposed. The first question we want to discuss is from whom we are protected. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law. The courts have decided this applies to all levels of government, both at the state and federal level. So we are protected from the government infringing upon our rights. That means that the First Amendment does not protect you from individuals from infringing on your rights. So, for example, let's say you work at a local restaurant. You wear a Trump for President button. If your boss tells you that you have to take it off, you have to take it off. But if you're walking down the street and a police officer tells you to take off the button, that's a clear violation of your First Amendment rights. Another way of thinking about that, wearing masks during the pandemic. Some people thought they had the right to not wear the mask because they woke up this morning in a free country. Well, if you walk into a store, that's public property, or not public property, private property, or at least quasi public property. And no, you do not have the right to not wear a mask if it's posted on the door, or if someone asks you to put on a mask. So if you were walking around outside and there wasn't a government mandate to wear a mask, you don't have to wear a mask. So it does depend on where you are sometimes. Well, let's see what Trace Atkins has to say about this.
There's a lot of people in this country today who don't understand, they hide behind the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and they say that it gives them the right to run around and be a smartass and say anything they want to. That's not what the First Amendment does. The First Amendment protects you from the government. Our founding fathers ensured that you could criticize your government and they wouldn't be able to do anything to you about it. So that's what the First Amendment really means. It doesn't protect you from me. If I don't like what you're saying, I might hunt you down and give you a beating. That's So be advised, you can't just be around me and run your trap and say whatever you want to and think that you can hide behind the First Amendment. I'll beat the hell out of you, and and then we'll deal with it in court, whatever. I've been to jail before. I ain't scared. I'll go back again. That's what I tell my daughter's boyfriends.
So the next question is, what is protected? Remember, the First Amendment was created out of an environment where political and religious expression was censored and persecuted. And it's that type of speech that receives the most protection today. That means that political, social, cultural, and religious speech are at the top of what is protected. Speech that is specifically meant to advance those goals are going to be more likely to be protected than not be protected. For example, in 2002, a high school student was punished for showing a banner reading "Bong Hits for Jesus" at a public event that was endorsed by the school. He was standing across the street from the school, but that's another story. The court said that that speech was unprotected because it advocated drug use. The high school student actually said that it was a nonsensical phrase that really had no no meaning to it. However, had the banner said, "Legalize marijuana now," which was a topic of great debate at the time, it's entirely possible that speech would have been protected. Even speech that is highly controversial or uses strong language is protected. For example, the Supreme Court protected the rights of Paul Robert Cohen for wearing a jacket inside a city courthouse with the words that you see on the right here on this poster, protesting a military draft. The court famously said, a man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. So, there are limits, but it depends on the nature of the limit that the government is trying to impose. The Cohen case dealt with the content of speech. When courts decide whether government regulation pushing certain types of content should pass constitutional muster, they use something called strict scrutiny. When the government wants to make a law affecting the content of speech, they must make sure that the rule is narrowly tailored to advance a compelling government interest. In other words, it can't be too broad, covering everything. It has to be very specific. That means it must be so specific as to advance the government interest, but not inadvertently punish protected speech, such as speech about politics. It is difficult for the government to restrict the content of speech. It can impose reasonable restrictions when the rules are content neutral. For example, the government may not be concerned with what I'm saying, but they might have an interest in limiting when, how, and where I say it. For example, a protest rally in front of a college residential hall at noon might be okay, but one at 3 a.m. probably wouldn't be. We sometimes get some protesters on campus, and they are restricted as to time, place, and manner. They are told when they can be on campus to protest, where, specifically between this area and this area here. They usually give them a little grass area in the center of campus. And what manner, can they use megaphones? Can they use signs? Can they, videotape, stuff like that. That can be regulated, because if they do that for everyone, it's okay. But when they start saying which groups they will restrict time, place, and manner, then you get into problems with constitutionality. Now, certain populations are less protected than others. For example, prisoners enjoy very little First Amendment protections. Many believe high school students are in a similar situation and don't have many First Amendment rights. But court cases have said they do, except in certain circumstances. For example, the Supreme Court ruled back in 1969 that 13-year-old Mary Beth Tinker had the right to wear a black armband to school to protest the Vietnam War, because the protest did not substantially cause, let me say that again, because the protest didn't interfere with the teaching of the day. College students do enjoy more First Amendment rights than high school students, but lately there have been some court cases that have started to chisel away at that freedom. Specifically in Indiana, the 7th District Court, and a case, it'll come up in your law classes. You'll find out about it. I'm not very happy with that case. Also, certain contexts are less protected than others. In the FCC versus Pacifica case in 1978, the Supreme Court said that broadcasters could be more regulated than print because of the pervasiveness of the medium. In other words, it's everywhere. This case dealt with the FCC fining a radio station after it had played George Carlin's 7 Dirty Words Act. The act is about which words you can't say on television and radio, and a radio station decided to play it. So you can see how that immediately caused some trouble. If you haven't heard that routine from George Carlin, Google it, but do know that it does contain many dirty words. When the government does make laws to I'm going to start this slide over again. When the government does make laws to restrict speech, it can only punish after the speech has been published. Courts have consistently said that it is unconstitutional for a government to impose prior restraint on a speaker. That means that even when speech could be punished later, the government cannot engage in pre-publication censorship. Prior restraint is almost always unconstitutional. The framers of the Constitution wanted to make sure that if there was anything that could be prevented, it was censorship, which came in the form of licensing in England. And in the U.S., no one needs a license to speak, and no one needs a license to be a journalist. Courts have said that the First Amendment needs breathing room. Without the breathing room that comes with broad freedoms and no censorship, we avoid a chilling effect on speech that could happen otherwise. So, what's the takeaway from this lecture? The bottom line is that while we might be tempted to restrict vile ideas, there are two very good reasons to keep the marketplace of ideas free. By fighting for a minority viewpoint today, you are protecting your rights for tomorrow. By not protecting rights of minority viewpoints, we forget that free speech has caused positive change in the world already. And, more importantly, who decides which speech is okay and which speech is not okay? What is acceptable and what is not acceptable? Perhaps First Amendment lawyer Floyd Abrams said it best. The First Amendment issues are always unpopular, and that's why we need a First Amendment. No matter what we think of freedom of speech or any responsibilities that might come along with those freedoms, we are better informed to discuss and use these rights if we understand their foundations and historical progression and exercise the First Amendment with that in mind.